All right, hi everyone. My name is Cindy Erickson. I'm currently working with Professor Junji Zhu in the physics department, and today I'll be presenting my research capstone on improving signal separation of longitudinally polarized WZ boson events. So this is a particle physics project, so I'll start with a quick background of some of the particle physics that motivates the project. So in the standard model of physics, forces are mediated by small elementary particles called vector bosons. You can imagine matter particles kind of throwing back and forth these tiny little force particles. And that's how forces like electromagnetism and the weak force are mediated. So while other force mediators like the photon are massless, the W and Z bosons, which are the force particles for the weak interaction, are massive. And so the masses of these bosons are acquired through the Higgs mechanism. So a Higgs field is introduced to cause electroweak symmetry breaking. And so that basically means at very high energies, the weak force and the electromagnetic force are unified. And then once a critical energy is reached as the universe cools down, those forces break apart into their constituent parts. So when this happens, there are 3 massless Goldstone bosons and 1 massive Higgs boson. And that massive Higgs boson was recently discovered in 2012 at CERN. So basically what happens is there are W and Z scalar bosons that are initially massless, and they absorb the 3 massless Goldstone bosons, which results in a W plus boson, a W minus boson, and a Z boson that all have mass. So therefore, the study of longitudinal vector boson interactions, specifically W and Z vector bosons, is of high interest because the longitudinal components of those bosons are acquired through electroweak symmetry breaking. So we are looking at a first study of these interactions using a particular decay channel where events are collected at the ATLAS experiment, which sits around the Large Hadron Collider run by CERN. That's the large particle accelerator that sits between Switzerland and France. And so in these events, 2 protons collide, resulting in a W and Z boson, which interact and which further decays into 3 leptons and 1 neutrino. So there's 3 channels that produce these events: the S channel, the T channel, and the U channel. And we aim to focus on the S channel, which unfortunately only makes up 10% of events. And then on top of that, we are looking for specifically longitudinal interactions of W and Z bosons. But there are 3 other possible polarization states, including longitudinal transversal, transversal, and transversal longitudinal. So our signal is only 0.6% of events. So the biggest challenge in this study is developing techniques to separate out the signal events from background. So the first method that we use to filter out our signal events is a series of selection cuts. And so basically we start out with our events. We require that events have to pass these 3 set of criteria, and then events that pass those criteria are put into what's called the LL enhanced fiducial region. And so the 3 cuts are detailed below. The first cut is a set of 3 subcuts that are on different lepton variables. And then the second cut is on the transverse momentum of the Z boson. And then the third cut is on the transverse momentum of the WZ system. So as you can see, when we use these selection cuts, we can improve the LL polarization fraction from 0.058 to 0.257, which is a good improvement. But this isn't quite enough for us to take a measurement yet. And so we aim to apply multivariate techniques in addition to these selection cuts to improve our LL polarization fraction even further. So for the data set for this study, we use a truth level simulated data set in the LL enhanced region, and that's generated using MADGraph and Pythia merging. So we approach this as a binary classification problem. So we assign a label of 1 to our signal LL events, and then a label of 0 to the other 3 polarization states. And so we use the XGBoost boosted decision tree ensemble model. And it was originally developed by Tianqi Chen for the Higgs machine learning competition. So we thought it would be particularly well suited to this type of similar problem. And so one part of the study that we did is we looked at different kinematic distributions of variables to find out which ones would have the best separation power, just like looking with the human eye. And so we came up with 6. So the first 3 are the cosine of different directions of different particles in different rest frames. So I have one shown down here, which is the direction of the W boson in the WZ rest frame with respect to the lab Z axis. And so then these other 3 are rapidity differences. And for rapidity, you can basically think of it as kind of like the momentum along the lab Z axis loosely. And so after deciding which features to use, we also tried to look at different methods to improve the default performance of XGBoost, which was pretty good just as a default, given that it was designed for this kind of problem. So we used some methods to avoid overfitting, including just a basic reweighting of training events to make sure that there's a 50% contribution from signal and a 50% contribution from background. We also used early stopping of boosting rounds using the AROC score on a validation set. And this basically just stops us from building a forest that's too big. If we have too many trees, we're going to overfit to fluctuations in the training set. We also looked at hyperparameter selection. So using a grid search over 5 different parameters and also using 5-fold cross validation to make the grid search more robust. And then finally, with machine learning, it's really important to make sure that the model is interpretable and that we understand what choices the model is making to make sure that it makes sense, right? It's not just finding some shortcut. And so we used the SHAT metric to evaluate feature importance after training. Okay, so the first result that I'll show here is the ROC curve, and you can see that I've plotted the performance of our model against a random classification curve in red, which is basically the worst possible scenario, which has an AROC score of 0.5, and then perfect classification, which is shown in green. And you'll see that hits the point of 0 false positive rate and 100% true positive rate. And so we want to see our blue curve from our model curve as much as possible up towards that perfect classification point. And from this, we see we get an AROC score of 0.825, which is significantly separated from that random classification curve, which means we've developed a model that does a pretty good job. And so our final AROC score averaged over multiple runs is 0.825. And so finally, the whole point of this is not just to develop a model that can classify the events well, but we also need to use it to help improve the LL polarization fraction. So here I show the probability output, the probability score output from XGBoost ranges between 0 and 1, and a score of 1 means the model is 100% sure that that event is LL. And so you'll see that that probability is plotted in histograms for the 4 different polarizations, and you'll look to see the LL is in red, and the other backgrounds, most notably the TT background, which is the largest, is in purple. And if you can imagine taking a threshold at 0.54, and we only take events that have a probability score of higher than 0.54, we get rid of a lot of background while also keeping the majority of the signal events. So if we make this kind of final cut using the output from XGBoost, we can improve the LL polarization fraction from 0.257 to 0.506. And these results are specifically done on the testing set. So that's why the initial number looks different than the LL polarization fraction that I showed earlier, because to be consistent with the testing set, we averaged it over 5 different random selections of the testing set. So in conclusion, XGBoost can be used to further improve the separation between LL events and background polarizations using a truth level data set. Several angular variables, including the rapidity difference between the W and Z bosons and the cosine of the W direction in the WZ rest frame with respect to the lab Z axis, both turned out to have pretty good separation powers. And a multivariate separation technique will be a useful tool in the analysis framework for this study, and it will be used in the future to help extract the WLZL fraction from data. So some questions and answers, since this is virtual. So how did I get involved with this project? So I actually took 2 courses with Professor Zhu, Physics 351 and Physics 401. And so I went to his office hours a lot. And so I kind of oriented him before I went and asked if I could do research with him. And I also was just kind of interested in diving into a brand new research area, and experimental particle physics sounded really cool to me. So yeah, it kind of just fell right into place, and I'm really grateful for this research experience. And what inspired me? So I actually went to a conference for undergraduate women in physics my sophomore year, and I heard a talk from the former director of the Atlas experiment. And she gave this wonderful presentation on how cool Atlas was and how cool like particle physics was. And I had never really heard about it before. And I just thought if I could get involved with that, like that just would be so incredible, but I probably won't, like it's too hard. And yeah, I happened to just know a professor who was doing research in that area. So I feel like I got pretty lucky. But listening to her talk was really inspirational. It kind of like planted this seed that I wanted to dive into this research area. How do you hope to use what you learned from this project in your future career? I'm planning on doing a PhD in the same research area for the next 5 years. And I'm particularly interested in continuing to work on machine learning and maybe AI and stuff like that. So I'm hoping that some of the tools, like the toolkit that I've kind of developed by doing this project can help me get involved in more work like this in the future. All right, so that's my capstone. Thank you so much for listening if you're still here. And yeah.